The super empath who lives in the avoidance head 24/7. Let's talk about something that almost no one sees, but it's happening all the time. There's someone out there, maybe it's you, who gives deeply, feels deeply, and connects deeply. You don't just care, you absorb. You walk into a room and you can feel people's moods before they speak. You're the one who notices the slight change in tone, the quick glance away, the shift in energy. You're a super empath, but somehow you end up magnetized to someone who runs, someone who avoids, who shuts down, who disappears emotionally the second things get too real. And here's the twist. Even when you're not physically there, you are. You live in their head constantly. You see, the avoidant doesn't forget you. They can't. You're too impactful. Your presence was too rich, too sincere, too deep. And ironically, that depth is exactly what they weren't ready to hold. But don't confuse emotional absence with indifference. Many avoidants are thinking about you more than they'll ever admit, to themselves or to anyone else. Your voice lives in their head. Your kindness is a contrast to their walls. You are the mirror they try to avoid because it reflects their fears, their lack, their unfinished emotional business. But here's what I want you to remember. Your power wasn't in fixing them. It was in waking them up. You don't chase. You don't beg. You don't shrink yourself to be less much. You leave or you create distance, not to punish them, but to protect your peace. And that's when your value explodes in their mind, because now there's space for them to notice your absence, space for them to feel the vacuum that only true presence can create when it's gone. So don't ever think your deep love was wasted. You are unforgettable. You are unforgettable, even when they don't reach out, even when they pretend it didn't matter. You're still living rent-free in their mind. And your job, it's not to wait, it's to rise again for yourself. Because a super empath's power isn't in being available to everyone. It's in being discerning with their gift. A super empath has a way of leaving a mark that goes far beyond what most people can see. When they connect with someone, especially someone with avoidant tendencies, their presence isn't just felt in the moment. It lingers. It's easy to think that the avoidant person, the one who pulls back, withdraws, or keeps things at arm's length, simply doesn't care. On the surface, that might even look true. The avoidant partner may seem cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable. But what's really happening beneath that calm or detached exterior is something far more complex. The empath, through their warmth, attentiveness, and genuine emotional availability, creates an imprint on the avoidant that's hard to shake. The avoidant person may try to act indifferent, but the reality is they have been deeply affected by the connection. The empath's ability to see through the cracks, to notice the subtle shifts in mood or energy, and to offer unconditional understanding does something powerful. It breaks through walls that the avoidant has spent years, sometimes a lifetime, building. This impact is not always comfortable for the avoidant. In fact, it's often the opposite. The connection feels intense, overwhelming, maybe even threatening to their sense of control. The empath's depth forces the avoidant to confront emotions they would rather bury. The kindness, the patience, the way the empath stays open even when things feel uncertain. All of that registers. Even if the avoidant runs or shuts down, they can't unfeel what they felt. The connection stays with them, playing over in their mind, whether they admit it or not. The empath lives in their head, not because the avoidant wants it that way, but because the bond was real. Realness is hard to erase, no matter how much someone tries to detach from it. The avoidant might go on with their life, keeping busy, distracting themselves, appearing unaffected, but in quiet moments, in the spaces between distractions, the empath is there. The way they looked at them, the words they spoke, the emotional safety they offered. These moments replay, sometimes as comfort, sometimes as discomfort. It's sometimes as difficult to know which moments are which. The avoidant may not reach out, may not express it, but the emotional impact of the empath's presence is undeniable. It becomes part of their internal world, something they carry, something they think about, even when they try to convince themselves they don't need anyone. The super empath's influence endures, quietly but powerfully, in the avoidant's mind and heart. Avoidants often have a pattern of retreating when emotions get intense, especially when they feel vulnerable or out of control. But just because they pull away doesn't mean they stop thinking or feeling. In fact, what usually happens is the opposite. The emotional residue left by a deeply connected experience with a super empath doesn't fade quickly. It stays. And in many cases, it becomes louder in their mind the further away they get from that connection. The absence doesn't create relief, it creates awareness. When someone, like a super empath, exits or pulls back, it disrupts the avoidance emotional system, even if they don't show it outwardly. Avoidants often process feelings internally, and they're not always in touch with the language to explain what they're experiencing, but they think a lot. They replay conversations, remember moments of closeness, and wonder, sometimes obsessively, what went wrong. They might not act on those thoughts. They might not send the text or make the call. But mentally and emotionally, the connection is still very much alive. The empath, with their rare emotional clarity and warmth, becomes a sort of internal compass, reminding the avoidant of what they had and what they're now without. The empath becomes a presence in their mind that contrasts with the coldness they're used to or the guarded life they've built. This doesn't mean the avoidant is suddenly ready to open up or change. Often, they struggle with the internal conflict, the longing for closeness versus the fear of losing control or being hurt. That internal tug of war makes the memory of the empath even more persistent. It's not that the avoidant forgot. They can't. The way the empath made them feel, the emotional safety that was offered, the non-judgmental space to be seen, those things register deeply. Even if the avoidant didn't fully accept them in the moment, they're etched into memory in a way that doesn't fade with distance or time. Sometimes the avoidant may even try to replace the empath, jump into something else quickly, hoping to drown out the feelings. But shallow connections only make the absence of depth more obvious. No one quite matches the way the empath listened, understood, or made them feel at ease. That emotional imprint becomes a quiet companion, following them into new experiences, making comparisons, and reminding them of the bond they couldn't or wouldn't hold on to. So while the world may never see the avoidance turmoil, the empath lives in their internal dialogue, not as a past chapter, but as an ever-present influence. When a super empath enters the life of someone with avoidant tendencies, it's more than just a relationship, it's an emotional confrontation. The empath doesn't even have to try. Just by being authentic, emotionally open, and tuned in, they begin to expose layers in the avoidant that have long been hidden or protected. For someone who has spent years dodging vulnerability, this kind of connection is disarming. The empath offers the one thing the avoidant both craves and fears: emotional intimacy. And it shakes something loose. The empath's depth reflects the exact thing the avoidant is uncomfortable confronting within themselves: their unmet needs, their unresolved pain, their fear of abandonment or failure. In this emotional dynamic, the empath doesn't need to point anything out directly. Their presence alone creates a mirror. Through their attentiveness, their gentle questions, and their consistent emotional availability, the avoidant is subtly reminded of everything they've pushed away or suppressed. They may not have the words to name it, but they feel it. And instead of leaning in, many avoidants retreat, because to receive love that pure and grounded would require them to drop the mask, lower the walls, and face the deeper wounds that have kept them guarded. The empath's love challenges the avoidance belief system. It interrupts their narrative that closeness equals danger, that needing someone is weakness, or that intimacy inevitably leads to pain. The avoidant may even start to feel emotionally exposed, not because the empath is intrusive, but because they are so effortlessly perceptive. They see past the avoidant's surface, the detachment, the jokes, the nonchalant attitude, and they reach into what's real. That's terrifying for someone who's spent years constructing a fortress around their feelings. This emotional exposure can trigger all kinds of defensive behaviors. The avoidant might start arguments, disappear for stretches, or emotionally numb themselves. But none of these reactions mean they weren't moved. They were, deeply. So deeply, in fact, that they didn't know how to stay. The problem isn't that the empath was too much. It's that they were exactly enough to stir what had long been dormant. And that kind of emotional awakening, while powerful, is often more than the avoidant is ready to hold. So the empath becomes unforgettable, not just because of what they gave, but because of what they reflected back. They showed the avoidant what was possible, what was buried, and most importantly, what was missing. When a super empath pulls back from an avoidant partner, it's often misunderstood. To the outside world, or even to the avoidant themselves, it might look like rejection, bitterness, or emotional coldness. But that's far from the truth. The decision to step back is rarely made out of anger. It's born from exhaustion. It's born from the quiet realization that continuing to show up for someone who won't meet them halfway is costing too much, mentally, emotionally, and even physically. Empaths are wired to give, to understand, to nurture. But there's a breaking point, and when it's reached, something shifts. That pullback isn't punishment. It's preservation. Pulling back is not a weakness for the empath. In fact, it's one of the bravest things they do. Because walking away or creating distance from someone they care about, someone they still feel connected to, goes against every instinct they have. But they do it anyway, not because they've stopped caring, but because they've started caring for themselves. There's only so long someone can pour love into a container with no bottom. And the empath realizes, often painfully, that staying in the dynamic any longer means losing parts of themselves they fought hard to build. To the avoidant, this withdrawal can be confusing. They may assume the empath has suddenly changed. That's not the case. The empath has simply recalibrated. They've recognized that love without reciprocity becomes a slow erosion of self. So, they draw boundary. They retreat, not with anger, but with clarity. They stop reaching out. They stop explaining themselves. They stop making excuses for the avoidance behavior. And this silence often speaks louder than anything else. It's in that space, the absence, that the avoidant begins to notice just how much the empath was holding. The conversations, the emotional labor, the understanding, the patience, all of it is gone, and in its place is a quiet void. It's in this stillness that the avoidant is confronted with the consequences of their avoidance. The empath, who once felt like a soft place to land, is now a reminder of what they lost through inaction. But the empath doesn't pull back to provoke regret. They do it to regain peace, to breathe again, to reconnect with themselves outside the constant emotional management of someone else's fears. And that decision to protect their energy isn't just an act of strength. It's a declaration. My love is a gift, not a guarantee. Super empaths often spend years believing their value is tied to how deeply they can love others, how much they can fix, how well they can endure. They pour themselves into relationships, giving endlessly, hoping that their consistency and compassion will finally make someone stay. Especially in relationships with avoidant partners, empaths can start to internalize the false idea that if they were just more patient, more understanding, more forgiving, they'd finally be chosen in the way they deserve. But the truth is far more empowering. Being chosen by someone else is never the metric of their worth. The real power lies in choosing themselves again and again, especially when it's hardest. The avoidant may never recognize or acknowledge the depth of what the empath offered, and that can hurt deeply. For someone who gives so much from the heart, being overlooked or emotionally dismissed can feel like rejection at the core of their identity. But what the empath often learns, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, is that their ability to love isn't the problem. Their sensitivity, their insight, their capacity to see into people, none of that needs to be toned down. What does need to shift is the belief that love must come with self-sacrifice. Choosing themselves doesn't mean the empath stops caring. It means they finally understand that love without balance leads to depletion. They stop begging to be seen. They stop proving their worth. They stop interpreting someone else's emotional unavailability as a reflection of their own shortcomings, because it never was. The avoidant's inability to show up isn't about the empath's lack, it's about the avoidant's fear. And no amount of love can outpace someone else's emotional walls. When the empath begins to choose themselves, something radical happens. They start to discern. They start asking different questions. Is this person capable of meeting me where I am? Do they value emotional safety the way I do? Can they hold space for me the way I hold space for others? That shift is everything, because now they're not waiting to be picked. They're doing the picking from a place of self-awareness, not need. In that shift, their power returns. Not because someone finally realized how special they are, but because they did. The world doesn't get to define the empath's value. Relationships don't get to determine their worth. Their ability to love is still intact, still beautiful. But now it's paired with boundaries. And that makes it unstoppable. So if you've ever found yourself loving deeply, giving fully, and still being met with silence, distance, or emotional walls, know this. It wasn't because you were too much. It was because your presence was powerful enough to awaken something that couldn't yet be faced. You didn't fail, you reflected truth. You didn't break, you expanded. You were the moment they'll compare others to, the depth they weren't ready for, the clarity they'll remember when the noise settles. But this isn't about waiting for them to see it. It's about you seeing it now. Your empathy isn't a weakness. Your sensitivity isn't a flaw. They are your superpowers. And when you stop giving them away to people who can't hold them, you begin to rise in a way no one can ignore, including the ones who once did. So don't shrink. Don't harden. Don't doubt your gift just because someone couldn't receive it. Stand tall in your truth, protect your peace, and always, always choose you. Thank you for listening with your heart open. Thank you for holding space for these words. And most of all, thank you for being exactly who you are, because the world needs more people who feel deeply and love consciously. Take care of that heart of yours. It's rare, it's strong, and it's not meant for just anyone. Thank you.